The low hum of the airplane engines resonated through the cabin, blending seamlessly with the faint buzz of activity as passengers found their seats. Rachel Grant, seated comfortably in 1A, stared out of the window. The view outside was stunning. Streaks of gold and crimson painted the airport tarmac as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was one of those rare moments she allowed herself to savor. This trip was special, not just another grueling string of international meetings, but a moment to reflect and celebrate how far she'd come. Rachel, the founder and CEO of a thriving tech company, had built her empire from the ground up. Her childhood was a far cry from the luxury she now enjoyed. Growing up in a modest neighborhood with parents who worked tirelessly to make ends meet, Rachel learned early on that the world wasn't always kind to women like her. Yet, she had refused to be defined by limitations. Her parents had instilled in her an unyielding belief in hard work, resilience, and self-respect. Now, after years of relentless effort, she had achieved what many thought impossible. This flight in first class, this seat she had carefully reserved weeks ago, was more than just a comfortable journey. It was a symbol of her hard-earned success. Rachel adjusted the leather strap of her designer bag and pulled out her notebook, her fingers tracing the embossed initials on its cover. She opened it to jot down some thoughts for an upcoming project, but the sudden click of sharp heels on the cabin floor snapped her focus. She glanced up. A tall, impeccably dressed woman strode into the first-class cabin with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Her platinum blonde bob was perfectly coiffed, and her tailored blazer screamed luxury. A hesitant brunette trailed behind her, clearly uncomfortable. "This is ridiculous," the blonde woman exclaimed, her voice cutting through the cabin's calm like a knife. "Row 3? That can't be right." Rachel observed silently as the brunette mumbled, "I'm sure it's just a mistake, Lydia. Let's ask someone to fix it." But Lydia Morris, as the blonde soon revealed herself to be, was not one to wait. With a huff, she scanned the rows until her sharp eyes landed on Rachel. Striding over to her seat, Lydia stopped abruptly. "Excuse me," Lydia began. Her tone clipped with condescension. Rachel met her gaze calmly. "Yes? There's been a mistake," Lydia announced, waving a manicured hand toward the seat. "This is my seat, 1A. I always sit here." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "There's no mistake," she replied, her tone polite yet firm. She held up her boarding pass. "This seat is mine." For a moment, Lydia faltered, but her entitlement quickly reasserted itself. "You must have booked it last minute," she said, her lip curling into a sneer. "You'd probably be more comfortable in business class. Let's get the airline to sort this out." Rachel's expression remained composed. Her voice carried quiet authority. "I booked this seat weeks ago. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The tension between them thickened. Lydia's jaw tightened as she turned to a passing flight attendant, her frustration bubbling over. "Excuse me," she snapped. "There's an issue with my seat. This woman," she gestured dismissively toward Rachel, "is in it. Fix it." The young flight attendant, Alex, paused, visibly startled by Lydia's tone. He glanced between the two women, clearly uncomfortable. "Let me check," he said diplomatically. Rachel handed over her boarding pass without hesitation. Alex scanned it, nodding after a moment. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said to Lydia, "but seat 1A is correctly assigned to Miss Grant." "That can't be right," Lydia exclaimed, her voice rising. "I'm a Premier Diamond member. I always get 1A." "I'm sorry, ma'am," Alex repeated, his tone professional yet firm. The seat was reserved in advance. Lydia's polished facade began to crack. "You don't understand," she hissed, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "I'm a loyal customer. She can move to another seat, can't she?" Rachel's lips curved into a faint smile. Her tone was calm but unyielding. "I'm not moving." Alex shifted uncomfortably and glanced at Rachel. "Miss Grant, would you mind switching to another seat? It's still in first class." "No," Rachel said simply, her voice firm. "I booked this seat. I'm staying here." Lydia scoffed audibly, crossing her arms. "Are you seriously going to make a scene over this?" Rachel tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I'm not making a scene. I'm sitting in the seat I paid for." Passengers nearby pretended not to listen, but Rachel could feel their curiosity thickening the air. The situation escalated as Lydia's frustration erupted. "Do you even know who I am?" she hissed. Rachel met her gaze without flinching. "I know exactly who you are. Someone who thinks they're entitled to something that doesn't belong to them." Lydia's face turned crimson as she sputtered in disbelief, her words lost amidst the growing tension. It was clear she wasn't used to hearing no. The confrontation wasn't over, but Rachel remained calm. Her seat in 1A wasn't just a reservation. It was a statement, a declaration that she had earned her place, and no one's entitlement could take that away. The tension in the cabin was palpable as the confrontation continued. Rachel sat still, her posture unshaken, her eyes unwavering as Lydia seethed. The cabin hummed with whispers, passengers shifting in their seats, trying to look away but unable to fully ignore the drama unfolding before them. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about power, privilege, and the quiet strength of someone who had earned every inch of their success. Lydia, whose perfect facade was beginning to crack, turned back toward the flight attendant, her voice rising in indignation. "This is absolutely outrageous," she snapped. "I demand to speak with the captain. Right now." Her words cut through the air like a whip. Alex, who had remained remarkably calm so far, nodded once more. He knew there was nothing he could do to change the outcome. "Of course, ma'am. Please wait a moment." He turned on his heel, his footsteps quick and measured as he disappeared into the galley to find the captain. Rachel, meanwhile, remained as composed as ever. Her eyes never left Lydia, who now fumed in silence, her perfect hair slightly disheveled, the corners of her mouth twitching in frustration. Rachel didn't need to speak. She didn't need to shout or wave her arms to make her point clear. She had nothing to prove. Lydia, on the other hand, was all noise and bluster, her anger filling the cabin with a sharp, unsettling energy. Minutes passed, but for Rachel, it felt as though the world had slowed down. She took a deep breath, her gaze shifting momentarily to the window. The sky outside had darkened, the horizon now a deep velvet blue speckled with stars. The plane was still on the ground, but it felt as though the tension between her and Lydia had created an invisible force field around them, separating them from the world. Rachel let the stillness of the moment wash over her. She had fought so long and so hard for this life, and nothing was going to take it from her. Not a seat on a plane, not a petty argument, not anyone's misplaced sense of entitlement. A soft click interrupted her thoughts. The flight deck door opened, and the captain, a tall, composed man in his 50s, stepped into the cabin. His presence was commanding, silent, yet unmistakably authoritative. Dressed in his uniform, his posture straight and calm, he exuded a quiet confidence that seemed to quiet the entire cabin. Lydia, clearly desperate for a resolution that would favor her, immediately launched into a tirade. "Captain, thank you for coming," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "There's a serious issue with this woman's seat. This is my seat, and she's refusing to move." She gestured toward Rachel, who met the captain's gaze without flinching. The captain nodded slowly, taking in the situation with a practiced calm. He turned toward Rachel, who didn't look the least bit anxious, her composure unshaken. "Miss Grant, I assume there's no issue with your seat?" the captain asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Rachel smiled faintly, holding up her boarding pass once more. "No issue at all, Captain. I booked this seat in advance. It's mine." The captain nodded again, turning toward Lydia. "I'm afraid there's no issue here, Mrs. Morris. You'll have to return to your assigned seat." His voice was calm, but the underlying authority in his words left no room for argument. Lydia's face turned a shade of red that was almost comical. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She had been confronted with someone who wasn't intimidated by her status, who didn't care about her title, her wealth, or her perceived superiority. Rachel was unfazed, unbothered, and unwavering. "You don't understand," Lydia finally stammered, her voice sharp and desperate. "I'm a Premier Diamond member. I've flown this airline more times than you can count. I'm entitled to this seat." Rachel's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, though her eyes remained cold. "Entitlement doesn't change the facts," she said softly, her voice laced with calm authority. The captain glanced back at the flight attendant, Alex, who gave a subtle nod, confirming what he already knew. Lydia was in the wrong. She had no more claim to 1A than any other passenger. Lydia's fury was now fully evident. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "I'm going to report you to corporate. You'll regret this." The captain remained unfazed, his composure never wavering. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mrs. Morris. However, as I've already explained, this seat is properly assigned. I suggest you return to your seat." Lydia stood there for a moment, her chest heaving with frustration. Then, with a final huff, she turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle. The cabin fell silent. Rachel allowed herself a brief exhale, her posture relaxing just a fraction. She didn't take pleasure in the confrontation, but she knew this was more than just about a seat. It was about standing up for herself, for the principle that no one had the right to push her aside, no matter their wealth or status. As Lydia disappeared into the rear of the cabin, Rachel returned to her notebook, her fingers lightly grazing the pages as she prepared to continue her work. She had no need for further drama, but she could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The passengers who had been watching with wide eyes now returned to their own conversations, though many couldn't hide the glint of respect in their eyes. Rachel, however, remained focused. She had no time for distractions. She was exactly where she belonged. No apologies necessary. The atmosphere in first class had shifted. What had started as a minor dispute over a seat had grown into something much larger, an unspoken lesson in respect, dignity, and the consequences of entitlement. As Rachel sat quietly in her seat, the murmurs of the cabin simmered down, but the underlying tension was palpable. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances as the events unfolded before them. Rachel remained calm, her focus unbroken, her presence undeniable. Lydia, however, had not yet given up. She was seething, her face flushed with indignation. After storming away from the captain, she had made her way toward the rear of the cabin, but her actions were far from over. It was clear to anyone watching that she wouldn't leave this encounter quietly. Moments later, the cabin door swung open, and two sharply dressed men entered the plane. Their presence was immediate, commanding the attention of everyone in the cabin. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the first-class section until they locked onto Lydia. There was no mistaking who they were. They were security. The two men, exuding quiet authority, approached Lydia, who stood with her arms crossed, still muttering angrily under her breath. Her once polished appearance now seemed disheveled, her carefully crafted persona cracking under the weight of her entitlement. The men spoke in low tones, exchanging a few words with the flight supervisor, Diane, before they turned to Lydia. "Mrs. Morris," one of the men said, his voice smooth but firm, "we've been instructed to ask you to disembark the flight." Lydia's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? You can't do this. I'm a Premier Diamond member. You don't understand who I am." Her voice rose again, but this time it carried no weight. There was no one in the cabin to be impressed by her status, no one to be intimidated by her entitled tone. The second man, calm and collected, pulled out a tablet and showed it to Lydia. Her eyes narrowed as she read the screen. The message was clear. Corporate had revoked her Premier Diamond status. "Your behavior has caused a disruption, Mrs. Morris," the first man continued. "We've been ordered to escort you off the plane. Your status has been revoked." Lydia's face went pale as the full extent of her situation set in. Her protests became frantic. "No, you can't do this. I demand to speak to corporate. I have rights." But her words fell on deaf ears. The men didn't flinch. They were simply following orders, and those orders were not negotiable. Lydia's voice grew shrill as she tried to plead her case, but the security personnel remained stoic, their resolve unwavering. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder as passengers exchanged glances, some in disbelief, others in quiet approval. Rachel remained in her seat, her expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of the moment, the collective realization that Lydia had just been humbled, and that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Lydia's jaw clenched as she was led toward the aisle. Her attempts to resist were futile, and the security personnel, while polite, were unyielding. As they reached the door, Lydia cast one final, venomous glare toward Rachel. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice barely audible as she was escorted off the plane. The cabin door slid shut behind her with a soft hiss, sealing her fate. Silence hung in the air for a moment before the quiet buzz of conversation began to grow. Rachel exhaled slowly, her hands resting calmly on her lap. The lesson had been taught, and it was a lesson that would linger long after the plane took off. The flight attendant, Alex, returned to the front of the cabin, his demeanor slightly less tense now. He gave Rachel a polite nod of acknowledgement before moving on with his duties. The passengers, who had been watching the scene unfold, now returned to their own worlds, some clearly relieved, others still processing what had just happened. Rachel didn't look back. Her victory was quiet but decisive. It wasn't about proving a point to Lydia or anyone else. It was about maintaining her dignity, her self-respect, and her space in the world. As the plane finally taxied toward the runway, Rachel's mind drifted back to the events that had brought her here, to this moment, to this seat. She thought of her parents, who had always told her that the only way to overcome the world's limitations was to stand firm, to never shrink or apologize for who she was. Her success hadn't come without sacrifice. There had been moments of doubt, moments when the weight of expectations threatened to crush her. But she had always pushed forward, always believed in herself even when others didn't. Now, as the plane lifted off the ground and the lights of the city began to fade beneath her, Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a victory over Lydia. It was a victory over every person, every obstacle, and every doubt that had ever tried to hold her back. She had made it. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure, but Rachel barely heard it. She was lost in her thoughts, the hum of the engines beneath her feet a comforting reminder of the long road she had traveled to get here. As the plane soared into the night sky, Rachel's thoughts turned to the future. There would be more challenges ahead, more people like Lydia who would try to knock her down, but she was ready to face whatever came next with the same quiet strength, the same unshakable resolve. In the end, Rachel knew that nothing could take away what she had earned. Not entitlement, not arrogance, not anyone's misguided sense of superiority. She had worked for everything she had, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. The plane flew on, and Rachel Grant remained in her seat, unbothered, unbroken, and unmistakably in control.